So as I said in class last week, we basically finished the first component of the class. So the first component of the class was all about the meaning specifically of names and metasemantic questions about names as well. In this unit of the class, we're going to ask a more general but related question, a more general metasemantic question of just like, how do words get meanings in the first place? And we're going to be focusing more particularly on sentences in this case than individual words. So last time we were focused particularly on names. We're going to be thinking more about whole sentences. How do whole sentences get their meanings? We're going to start today thinking about those kinds of questions by thinking about this passage from Wittgenstein's Philosophical Investigations. And what he's going to be doing is he's going to be painting a picture of language where basically all there is to meaning is use. Now, this is a common idea which we're going to come back to, because clearly there's some connection between what words mean and the fact that we use them in particular ways. But in this book, Wittgenstein takes a sort of very extreme approach to this and says there really is nothing more to the meaning of words than just their use in a particular way. And in fact, he's going to even reject the possibility of what we might call a systematic theory of meaning for a language. We're going to consider this for a few reasons. One, because I think this excerpt is very interesting. It's a cool thing to read. It's very different from anything that we've read in the course before. The second reason, though, is because it's going to be a foil to a lot of the stuff that comes next. This kind of unsystematic view of language is, I would say, largely, not completely, but largely rejected by philosophers today. But I want to give it its due and spend some time thinking about it before we move on to other more systematic views. The final thing I'll say about Wittgenstein is about the way that this text is written. Because as I mentioned, it's really very different from anything we've read before. It's written in a very different way. So it's an excerpt of a much longer book. But the book is basically just a series of these, little numbered sections, like you found. So he has these little numbered sections, 1, 2, 3. And basically the entire book is just a series of these kind of observations. Now, Wittgenstein had a very specific kind of idiosyncratic view at this stage of what doing philosophy amounts to. He sort of viewed doing philosophy properly as a kind of therapy, a sort of disabusing yourself of various problems. Why did he think of philosophy as therapy? Well, basically because he thought that philosophical problems are just sort of kinds of confusions. And making progress in philosophy consists not really in answering the problems, but kind of coming to see why they were mistaken in the first place. And one specific area he thought that this applied to is language. So we spent a lot of time thinking about meaning, what words mean, and so on. Wittgenstein himself spent a lot of time thinking about things in these terms. He has an entire book written before this called the Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus, where he had a view pretty similar to the views of Frege and Russell, and he took it to kind of an extreme. But at this stage in his sort of philosophical development, Wittgenstein thought that the view of language he was thinking of before was kind of profoundly mistaken. And what he's doing in this text is sort of trying to disabuse himself and the reader of this kind of view of language. And the particular thing he thought, or at least one of the particular things he thought was mistaken, was the idea that it's possible to give a sort of systematic theory of language and what words mean. So in that way, what Wittgenstein is doing is kind of quite different from what we've talked about before. He's not sort of giving his own theory of how things go. Rather, what he's trying to do is trying to make you see that there was never any need for a theory in the first place, that the drive to try and give a theory is based on some sort of deep misunderstanding of what's going on. So for this reason, because he's trying to do something quite different from what was done from what other philosophers have been trying to do, he also writes in a very different way. So it's not like some of the previous texts we saw before. It's not like he identifies a thesis very clearly and then he gives some arguments against it. The way he writes is really quite different. Now, the way I'm going to approach things today is I'm going to kind of do some violence to that, in that I'm going to try to somewhat present it as a series of claims and arguments. I want to say that I think Wittgenstein would really have resisted this. He really think that is not what he's trying to do. I do this because I'm not so much interested in exactly the right way to understand Wittgenstein. What I'm interested in is to try and understand a very natural point of view about language, i.e. the idea that language is fundamentally unsystematic. and use some kind of ideas that Wittgenstein suggests to try and unpack why you might have that view. Now, I think, as a matter of fact, what the way we're going to understand it is relatively faithful to what Wittgenstein was doing. But I want to signal up front that Wittgenstein himself thought of himself as doing something very different. It's kind of hard to completely make sense of what he thought he was doing. And moreover, there is kind of an intelligible way to fit it into the normal way of doing philosophy. So that's the kind of the way I'm going to present it today. But I want to flag at the top that the right way to understand what Wittgenstein is doing and the right way to present it, these are very vexed issues in philosophy, and they're very difficult questions when it comes to interpreting him. But that's how we're going to proceed today anyway.